my name is Shelby Chung, and I've been asked by Rogers TV to do some election coverage, and I've roped a good friend of mine, Gale, who
hey, Shelby.
Previous city manager of Thunder Bay.
Now retired.
Now retired, previous chief of EMS.
Yes.
Now retired from that too.
Well, became city manager.
Became city manager. What else have you done? Maybe give people a bit of a background on.
Well, I've been retired now for about 9 months, and I have been enjoying that thoroughly. And I do a couple of little things on the side here and there, and that's about it. I'm a retired guy.
Retired guy.
Yep.
All right, before we get into today, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. I just want to say we're on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation and Mkiwaju. This territory is also home to historic Métis people as well. And yeah. Let's get into it.
Honored to be here.
Yeah, let's get into it. Okay, the show's called The Local Campaign. Is there going to be sound effects?
I'm not bringing them.
Okay, let's get into it. We're talking about Northern Ontario. We have 4 ridings that we'll talk about: Thunder Bay, Superior North, Thunder Bay, Rainy River. They've changed some names on these, so I just want to make sure I get them right. We've Thunder Bay, Superior North, Sault Ste. Marie, Algoma, as well as Kenora, Kiiwetinoong. All right, let's talk about thoughts on overall impression. I know we were talking the polling earlier.
Yeah.
Do you want to start with that?
Sure. I have a thought.
Okay, let's hear your thoughts.
On the overall impression, the first thing that comes to my mind is the remarkable change that happened with party standing in the past 3 months. Attributable directly, I think, to USA President Donald Trump and his words and his actions and his commentary on Canada. 4 months ago, the Conservative Party of Canada and Pierre Poilievre were clearly in the lead, and with a massive lead, and everyone thought a Conservative majority government was the fait accompli. And then it switched.
Do we know why it switched? Like, I mean, I could take a guess, but I can't really pinpoint. I mean, okay, so Trudeau obviously steps down.
Yeah. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau leaves. So a punching bag of Pierre Poilievre and a source of consternation for many Canadians. That changes the dynamic. But also President Donald Trump and the tariffs, economic warfare, and his commentary on Canada. And a view by many Canadians changes who's best suited and best able to combat Donald Trump and his aggressiveness towards Canada. And Trump's aggressiveness is toned down in the past few weeks, but it's arguable whether his position has actually changed. So I think these 2 factors clearly implicate or are cause of the big change that we've seen. What was to be a Conservative majority seems now to be a Liberal majority.
Do you think that, I was thinking, okay, so Mark Carney comes in, he's Prime Minister. Do you think if it was anyone else, they would be as successful? Well,
the only anyone else plausibly would be Chrystia Freeland.
Right.
And she has serious bona fides on the international stage: diplomacy, trade, security. So she probably would have been a credible person in that position for those purposes. But that's hypothetical. It is Carney, and Carney is contesting for the Prime Minister.
Can we talk about the French and English debates a little bit?
Sure.
You watched them?
I watched the English one.
Okay.
I did not watch the French one.
I watched the, I'm not a French speaker, but I did, I wanted to know if there was nuanced differences between the 2, so I did watch the coverage of the French one. Okay, let's talk about the 2 that maybe we know for sure are not going to be Prime Minister.
Right.
Leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh.
Yeah.
Leader of the Bloc Québécois.
As sure things could be in an election, right? But it does not look good for either one of those.
Right. Well, and I think they're fighting for their seats, party relevancy.
Jagmeet Singh was asked today what he would do if he did not perform well, if the NDP did not perform well, and he made the right answer, which was a non-answer. He's fighting the election now and intends to win.
Right. I get the sense that Conservatives may have some regrets carpet bombing the NDP as much as they have in the past, completely decimating them, because I think they should have relied on the NDP to take away some of that lefty liberal vote. Am I off base thinking that?
Well, I'm not sure, but you look at the dynamics. Carney has brought the Liberals closer to the center. Trudeau brought them left, probably more left than the federal Liberals have ever been, at least in my lifetime, which is a squeeze on.
Wait, more left than Jean Chrétien?
Oh, for sure. John Chrétien arguably center right.
Oh, okay.
Didn't run a deficit. Fiscal control. Him and Paul Martin were good partners in that way.
Okay.
It was Trudeau bringing them to left and left and left and left, and in the early part of Trudeau's terms, squeezing the NDP, and the NDP was fighting for relevance in the late two tweens, or whatever you call 218, 219. And Carney comes in and brings them further to the right. So back to your point about the Conservatives and attacking the NDP, perhaps the Conservatives were attacking the Liberals and Trudeau more than they were attacking the NDP because they were tracking left. Now they're tracking right and moving into blue Liberal or red territory, or red Tory territory now.
Well, if you think that if the Liberals are now moving to more of a centralist view, chewing into the Conservative base, which is, normal, would you not then think that the left would feel a little bit more disenfranchised from the Liberal Party, flip over to NDP? But that's clearly not the case.
Perhaps more red Tories or blue Liberals are leaving the Conservatives and going to the Liberals now that the Liberals are tracking more to the center.
Okay.
And in the Canadian spectrum, the far left, but I mean that it's all relative, not far left on the broad spectrum, but the left in the Canadian spectrum was probably never that strong to begin with. And disaffected red Tories are coming back to the Liberals now, and that's to the detriment of the Conservatives.
I like how your delivery is giving me sports analyst.
What was it? The English debate. The time was changed because of the Montreal Canadiens game, which I really thought was a good idea.
Yeah.
I watched both.
Okay, actually, let's pick up on that because I think that does something to solidify the Canadian vibe.
It's so Canadian.
Right?
It's a really cool thing.
Like, okay, we're having a federal election. Let's just put this on pause. The hockey is on. One moment, please.
What's really important? They both are.
Well,
so we could do both.
Right.
And it was in Montreal. So it's fantastic.
Right, and the debates were held in Montreal.
One of the party leaders said that they actually wanted this to happen so they could watch the hockey game. Do you remember who that was?
I thought it was Carney that said that.
Carney's a hockey guy. I don't remember, but one of them said that. So I thought that was a cool thing.
One thing I really appreciated about this debate was how civil everyone was.
Yeah.
It looked like there were moments after where they were kind of smiling at each other and shaking each other's hands. It kind of warmed my cold heart, Norm.
I found it refreshing. I spend far too much time, and I'm going to admit this now, paying attention to American politics. And the toxicity and the divide is just so profound. Use your word. It's actually disheartening to see what's happening there. But I agree with your observation on the nature of the debate and how they treated each other was, for me, refreshing and gives some hope.
Yeah. I was, Carney said at some points, I know when Jagmeet Singh and Pierre Poilievre were going back and forth about how many houses, was it 6 or was it 200,000? And it ended up being some number much less than 200,000, but much more than 6. And Carney was joking about the math. He's like, I'll just leave it there to a misunderstanding. And I thought it was very gentlemanly and it was very polite. I know I've commented to you before that it felt like Carney had more of a C-suite vibe to his debate style.
Sure, I agree with that.
I think he's probably a person that maybe doesn't have a lot of experience debating to this nature because he's been, you know, the big guy on campus. Nobody questions him like this. I thought he held his own in the debate, though. What do you think?
Bureaucrat and bureaucracy are not bad words. They have meaning, and it's important, and we need bureaucrats. And we
Is this because you were a bureaucrat?
Absolutely. You know, I speak from experience, but we need bureaucrats and we need bureaucracies to essentially protect us, right? Think about the food we eat. We need a bureaucracy to ensure that the food we eat is safe, your drinking water, and on and on. Carney is a bureaucrat, and he comes across that way, and I think it hurts him a little bit, not in my eyes, but I'm not usual. But I think it hurts him a little bit, and that is the way he has presented himself as an officiant, perhaps, where Poilievre, not the same.
Right,
And
well, he
Poilievre's,
cut his teeth in the political realm.
he grew up his whole life in the political theater, in the political world, and
that really showed in that debate, too. He was slippery in all the right spots.
well, I don't know about slippery, but I
nothing
think
stuck to him.
Poilievre won the debate, not on substance, but on style. I saw him look into the camera directly more often. I saw him
He
stumble
appealed to youth.
less often.
He appealed to youth as well, which the other candidates didn't.
That's interesting.
Yeah, when he was talking about young people buying homes. I was like, what?
Okay.
I was a little bit perked up for that.
Yeah. I think about my kids in that regard. We could probably talk about that later.
Is it because they still live with you?
This is an inside joke in our family. But I think Poilievre won the debate based on his style and his performance and his persona at that time in those moments. And I think the debates matter, and the debate will influence some people, not many, but some people. I don't know how many people watched the debate. Do you know how many people watched it?
At least 2.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, Carl watched it too. We're going to have Carl later
Carl will be on in a few minutes. Yeah. Did you notice the time tracker on the debate?
No.
Each one of them had a time tracker and tracked how much time they were actually speaking. And I thought that was fascinating.
Is that why Blanchette was like, oh, Carney's had 6 more minutes?
He did mention that.
A few times.
He
I'm
did
like,
mention
okay,
that. And when I was drawn to it. I was watching, Carney was like just slightly ahead of Poilievre the whole time, and then Singh and Blanchette were way behind. Not way behind, but behind. And I think at the end, Carney was about a minute ahead of Poilievre, and they were both 5 or 6 minutes ahead of the other two. And I thought, well, that's interesting. It was kind of neat. And I thought the debate was really good, too. The format was good.
Yeah.
Different things. And
they shortened up the time. They asked a question that had 45-second time frame, then 30-second, and then...
The conclusion was interesting, too, where they got to ask each other one question. All 3 of them asked Carney the question. And then Carney at the end.
Might as well ask myself
The joke fell flat.
What? I thought it was funny.
It didn't work. It fell flat.
Oh.
I'm going to ask myself a question.
We laugh at different things, though.
Yeah, I guess we do. But I'm going to ask myself a question, and then kind of stumbled, and I think he asked Poilievre a question about.
Yeah. Oh, his clearance.
Oh, the security clearance.
Which he actually had a really good answer for. I don't know how that works, so I don't know. He's like, because I would have to be muzzled if I wanted to talk about Chinese, interference or something.
I think that's a leadership issue.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. You want to lead the country, you should have a security clearance.
I mean, yeah, fair. I thought he answered the question well. That seemed like a credible response. It wasn't just well, I don't need it, like.
Well, I don't think he was glib about it.
No.
I thought the answer was a good answer, but,
He seemed sincere for his answer.
As, Carney stumbled a little bit, Poilievre, I don't think that was a solid answer.
Right.
I understand it, but it's not a solid answer to the question.
Okay. On that note, we are on to our next segment. Thank you so much.
Ultimately, I feel like just having a candidate that I can rely on comfortably and have somebody that I can trust the word of when they make promises regarding the economic changes that they need to make, or the changes in regulation, or the focus on jobs personally. Like, I feel like when they promise these things, they need to be able to have a plan to back up on it.
I think investment in our First Nations, investment in our communities as a whole, whether that's through economy, cultural, transportation, protection of our forests and our rivers. I think that in our region in particular, I think is very important.
I would say the biggest issue is mass immigration, and that's not a problem, but bringing in criminals into the country is a problem for sure. So I think there needs to be more background checks on people that are coming into the country, and I think that'll make the country a better place.
Just making sure that investments are put in places that need to happen. And I think that the importance of engagement with our Indigenous partners is essential to our future.
In Sault Ste. Marie right now is the taxes on steel, our homeless problem, our drug problem. That's about the major concern. It affects me most because I'm a steel worker. So.
Well, I work for the United Steelworkers, so I'm the area coordinator for District 6. So my area goes all the way to Thunder Bay, Wawa, Gapaskis, all that area. However, we represent a lot of workers, and a lot of my members are getting affected. Tenaris, I'm in negotiations right now with Tenaris. They're producing tubes, so that's going to affect them somewhat. Everybody's getting affected from this nonsense, and that's why I think if they're going to start building infrastructures in Canada, this is an opportunity for Sault Ste. Marie to take advantage of it. And I need someone to represent Sault Ste. Marie who's going to be able to take my questions. If they're not going to take my questions, they're not going to get my vote, period.
Welcome back to the local campaign. My name is Shelby Chung. I'm here tonight with Norm Gale and Dr. Carl Skogstad.
Skogstad, but that's okay.
She practiced that 5 times.
I totally did. Thank you so much for meeting with us tonight. Election results are going to be live on the screen as the numbers come in. So let's get right to it. Canadian defense spending is one of several grievances Donald Trump has cited in his calls to make Canada the 51st state. U.S. President Donald Trump has said he wants NATO members to spend at least 5% of their GDP on defense, more than double our current target spend of 2% in our GDP. So the question for you, with each Canadian Party leader committed to increasing spending to at least 2%, what is your take on Donald Trump's pressure on Canada to increase military spending? And have our federal leaders done a good job with communicating their plans to address the issue?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
So that's a big question, right? And I'll just say, U.S. politicians grieving about NATO members not spending enough is not a new thing. It goes back to the very start of the alliance. So, maybe Donald Trump's threats are more credible than others have been because he's imposed tariff. And if you see that as a response to his not spending enough, then sure. But in general, people complaining about other countries not spending enough has a long history. We have a target of 2%. In 2014, all the NATO members got together in Wales and said, 2% is the target. That's what we want to hit. And Canada has never hit that. We haven't hit 2% since the 80s. So we are continuously underspending and not meeting our kind of agreement. I always say to people, NATO is a club, and we've joined that club. And the membership dues is 2%, and we're not meeting our membership dues. Now, in general, in most of the 90s and 2000s, things were, pretty, the world was kind of maybe a safer place, one might say. And so not hitting the target, the countries would be like, oh, you really should hit it, but a lot of them weren't hitting it too, and so we thought, okay, like, we're all not hitting it, we're not standing out. Lately, though, we are standing out. I think we're one of 2 countries now in what's called the quadrant of shame, where not only do we not spend enough money, but what we spend it on isn't really what NATO wants us to spend it on. They want 20% of our budget on new equipment, and we underspend on that too. So we're in that quadrant of shame it's just us in Belgium there now. So it's really obvious that we're not pulling our weight in that sense. So that's kind of the setup to this, right? So all these. That being said, I think before the election, there was a realization by Canadians that we need to do better. There was some polling data that came out around this time last year, actually, that showed Canadians were much more willing to spend on defense. And this was very surprising to pollsters when it came out. But it predates Donald Trump kind of coming back into office. So this is what happened, and the Canadian government, realizing this, maybe that investment was needed, did have a plan to ramp up spending to, I think it was 1.8% by 2030. They've since updated that to reach 2% by 2032. But now in all these party platforms, we're seeing that 2% by 2030 is the target. That's the Conservative target. That's the Liberal target. Their policies on defense are actually quite similar. Both of them 2% by 2030. Addressing the recruitment issue that's a major problem right now. Both have a focus on the Arctic, and both want to fix how procurement is done. So, the two major parties are very much aligned on how to fix the issues in defense. And for that reason, I've found it's not getting a lot of news coverage in the past few weeks. It hasn't, right? And again, because historically, elections in Canada aren't won or lost on the defense portfolio, so it makes sense that they wouldn't want to really focus on that, especially when their policies are largely aligned.
Carl, the NDP are saying 2032, so they agree on 2% and going 2032 as well.
Yeah.
The Canadian Armed Forces are woefully understaffed, woefully under-equipped, and woefully unprepared for any type of conflict, except for small conflicts where we gear up, like Lithuania.
Yep.
We have a battle group there. This isn't on the soldier, the sailor, or the aircrew. This is political policy.
Yep.
And it's been decades since Canada has met the 2% threshold for NATO. You are quite right. That's NATO is a club, and Canada signed on to the 2%. I think 5 years ago we were at 1.2%.
Oh, yeah, we got under 1% at one point.
Yeah, so now we're at 1.4, 1.5.
Yeah, well, I think 1.38 is the.
Okay.
Yeah.
1 point. Let's say 1.4.
Yeah. Or is it
Here's the thing, though. Yes, the 2% GDP, gross domestic product, is self-imposed by the members of the club, and Canada did sign on to that. However, if you look at real defense spending, so Canada gets beat up a lot about this, and arguably rightly so. I, like you, would like to see increased defense spending, but I've always thought that way. But the 2% gross domestic project target does not reflect real defense spending. If you look at NATO as a club with 33 member nations, plus or minus, Canada has the 5th largest economy, perhaps. US, UK, Germany, France. We're tied with Italy's probably ahead of us, and we're tied with Spain, I think. Spain and us are very close. So let's call it the 6th largest economy out of 33 nations. Our real defense spending is very high.
Yeah, in dollar terms,
Yeah, sure. In real dollars is very high. Now, we're not going to compare Canada to Slovenia or Estonia, but when you compare Canada to other countries that are solid countries with good reputations on defense, Norway, we're spending a lot more in real dollars, yet we're not as effective. So is the 2% target from an economic standpoint the real test, even though it's self-imposed?
Yeah, so I guess the question you always have to ask yourself is, for what purpose do we want a military? What do we want our military to do? Now, we're very lucky in Canada, right? We are very secure. We have 3 oceans that separate us, and until recently, a very reliable ally to the south that, you never would have thought they would invade us. And if they did choose to invade us, realistically, we wouldn't fight a conventional war with them, right? And so when you think about what do we need to actually defend ourselves, it's probably, in some sense, probably a small number. It's quite hard to launch an intercontinental invasion, right? So in some sense, we could say, well, we've spent little because that's all we needed to get away with for actual defensive purposes. But if you want your military to, engage around the world, engage with your allies, to, go and, bomb a rebel somewhere because you think that's good policy, then you need to spend more money. Now, 2%, in some sense, people are saying that should be the new minimum, right? Like, I think Donald Trump said 5%, as you said. The question you have to ask as a Canadian, as a voter, is what do I want my military to do? Because right now it can't do much. And even at 2%, I would argue it probably can't do much. So that's where you start. What do we need our military to do? And to get there, what do we need to spend? And I would probably argue that for what we ask our military to do, because we like to see our soldiers go and fight, I think that we have that history of saying we want to be part of that international community going on these international missions, then you probably need to be spending a lot more if you want to kind of, be a part of that. So
that is a really good segue into the next question. So when we think about Arctic sovereignty, military recruitment and retention, and procurement of modern military equipment, what in your opinion do you think is the best place to start putting our money into? I mean, and those are just three examples.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the first thing I would put money in is simply increasing compensation to the military personnel. A student and I, we recently wrote a paper we're looking to publish that has tracked military pay over the past, I think, 20 years. If you compare it to industrial pay, there's a standard Statistics Canada industrial pay. There used to be a nice positive premium for being in the military, but in real inflation-adjusted terms, that gap's disappeared. So if you're young and looking to go into the workforce, you don't really choose the military because the compensation just isn't there. So the first thing I would do is, you got to increase compensation, right? And compensation can mean direct salaries, it can mean housing allowances, it can mean a lot of different things. So, but increase compensation, because you really need to deal with that recruitment and retention problem. I think they're about 14,000 personnel short, and that's out of a military of, if you combine regular forces and reservists, you want 100,000 roughly there. So you're at maybe just starting off 86% of your targeted strength, which is quite low, right? And so right away, that's where my money goes first. Second of all, you kind of want to get out of that quadrant of shame. So you want to at least spend more on procuring equipment. What you spend it on, again, that's kind of a personal question in the sense that if you think, I really want Canada to have more secured, I feel like maybe you say, I don't feel secure in Canada, then I say, okay, then you're going to spend on, maybe naval equipment and air equipment so you can control the Arctic a little better, control the sea lanes approaching Canada a little better. If you say, no, I really want my military to go on peacekeeping missions, or maybe you even say, I want my military to go and fight side by side with the Ukrainians, then maybe you're spending more on, the army. But that's really, you have to answer that first question of, what do I want my military to do? And, I have ideas about that, but I'm just one person, so I wouldn't, dare to tell the voter how to.
A doctor in economics with.
Carl, one of the economic challenges that has made the Canadian Armed Forces ineffective, one of them is procurement.
Yeah.
And the Canadian government's approach to procurement, red or blue, doesn't matter, whichever party, is looking at especially local economic development factors for procurement. The Canadian shipbuilding strategy is a great example. I think that's been a failure, a terrific failure that's been very costly over the past 2 decades. How should the government approach procurement to best make the armed forces more effective?
Yeah, so there was a policy in place called the Industrial Regional Benefit Policy, which was anytime you had a foreign company bidding on a contract, they had to explicitly say where they're going to reinvest in the country. The idea is, Canada wants a defense industrial base, but it's incredibly hard to establish and even more difficult to maintain. And so if you have these policies in place to force foreign firms to invest in local areas, then, on the surface it seems great because, politically you're never going to say, oh, we're going to spend $20 billion to acquire airplanes. We're going to get it from that factory in Ohio, and that's where the money's going. Sorry, no Canadian jobs. Canadians would be like, well, hold on a second, right? And so if we want those to be built in Canada or, have some part of the production process, so maybe we'll build the wings in a factory in Montreal or the landing gear in Winnipeg, okay, you can do that, but you have to be prepared to pay more money. There's a reason the factories aren't in those communities already, and it's from a competitive point of view, they just can't compete. And so if you're willing to spend more money per unit of equipment you acquire, then okay, we can have those policies, we can have those local industrial benefits to these communities, but you're paying for it, and it comes from either just higher sticker price per unit or acquiring fewer things. Instead of 80 planes, we'll get 50. And that has real consequences on the back end of what you want your military to do. So if you want your military procurement process to be a jobs creator, sure, we can do that. We know how to, but it's costly to do that. And in the long run, the data doesn't show that it creates long-term sustainable jobs. Now, maybe you might argue, well, you acquiring from the U.S. just isn't compatible with our policies anymore. Okay. Well, we can acquire from other countries. Europe would be very happy to sell us weapons, and we might be very happy to leverage that desire in a trade agreement with them.
Do you think there's a correlation between U.S. producing the world's supply of military equipment and Donald Trump also pressuring us to spend more money? Doesn't it seem a bit self-serving? I think the border and all the other stuff is just a tool to use to get us to buy more
weapons. Yeah. So they've always wanted us to buy more weapons. They want everyone to buy more of their weapons. The same way, we have a factory in London, Ontario that produces light armored vehicles, and we love to sell them to people. And even if we
can we get one?
Yeah, exactly. and even when the country you don't like, wants to, it's hard to say no when there's a regime that wants to buy them, and you're like, oh, we really don't like what you're going to do with it, but we really want that factory to exist and have those jobs.
Right.
So you really face do we close the factory? Because the factory only exists if it's producing something, right? You can't just have a factory sitting idle and say, well, we have the factory. It doesn't produce anything. So if it's not a foreign country buying it, it has to be us buying it. And we can keep buying light armored vehicles until we have more than we need just to keep the factory running. But there's probably less costly ways to employ those people if we wanted to do that. So.
Wonderful. Okay, we got 30 seconds left on the clock. Any last words?
Just the economic arguments for local production and producing our own equipment and weapons is good for security and good for the economy, but it's also part of the problem. And it has hindered the Canadian Armed Forces in their effectiveness over the past 3 decades.
I agree. They're very, you can't have them both, right? You either want good equipment produced in a timely and effective way at a lower cost, or you want to have that security of supply, as they say, where we produce it here, but there's a real cost to that, and there's a reason we really don't do too much here. Just an interesting number. There's more people working at gas stations in Canada than in Canadian defense industrial bases, like companies and that. So that gives you a size of how small our defense industry is.
Wow. That is an interesting statistic.
That is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carl Skogstad. Got it. Yes. We really appreciate having you on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. You're very welcome.
I'm Trevor Cheer, Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Department of Law and Politics at Algoma University. I think that more than most elections, this one seems to really be focused on the leadership styles and the leadership resumes of just a couple of the main parties. And really there's a big Donald Trump factor in this election. Ever since the President of the United States announced significant tariffs, specifically for Sault Ste. Marie, these are tariffs on steel and aluminum, as well as suggesting that Canada would be better off as the 51st state. The election has really focused on what party and what party leader, then Prime Minister, would be best disposed to make the Canadian economy resilient in the face of these tariffs, who would best negotiate with Trump and his team on the future trade negotiations in a few months, and who can make Canada resilient in a period of economic instability at first, and even in facing a president who sometimes thrives on keeping other world leaders guessing. This election feels different to me because in most elections, the different federal party leaders need to do two things. They need to convince the electorate about what the election is about, and then they need to convince the electorate that their party is the best at responding to that issue. So they're trying to find wedge issues where they can create a difference. They can win on that issue in relation to other parties. In this election, with the tariffs and this discourse of Canada being better off as a 51st state, it's pretty clear what the main issue in the election is about. It's the economy. It's the tariffs. It's affordability. There are other important issues, certainly like housing and health. But this one's about the economy and which party and party leader can make Canada most resilient in this crisis, really. It's also an interesting one because we're seeing a lot of the institutions in our neighbor to the south, democratic institutions, really under threat in that style of governance. And so this election, I think people are paying a little bit more attention to our own democratic practices and our own democratic institutions. We like to see people, for instance, show up to debates in Canada. It's not a time when we can even take these democratic practices and institutions for granted anymore. And so people are noticing when candidates don't show up for debates. The Conservative candidate locally hasn't been to debates in Sault Ste. Marie, Hugh Stevenson, and that's concerning for several other candidates, but also even Conservative supporters who are saying, hey, what's going on here? There hasn't yet been costed platforms published by the major parties. What happened to costed platforms? I'm sure they'll come out, but we're already, during this interview, we've had the French language debate, we're going to have the English language debate tonight, and there haven't been costed platforms yet. So I think that there's hunger for more transparency than we're getting. Because the electoral issue is about leadership and leading the economy, it's really become, I think, a leadership race that's more focused on the national level and the future of Canada rather than perhaps one's favorite local candidate. There are several challenges facing our community here in Sault Ste. Marie, Algoma. Housing is a big one. High costs of houses, high costs of rent, just not having enough housing available. So homelessness is a big issue. Precarious housing for students, including international students, is a big one. The cost of living is a real important issue. Groceries cost a mint these days. So there's precarity and affordability challenges. Access to health care, which is a shared provincial federal jurisdiction. Access to emergency rooms, to doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners, waiting lines, access to dental care. These are big issues. The economy, job precarity, especially in the face of Trump's current and threatened tariffs, is a huge issue for Sault Ste. Marie as a steel town. And mental health, drug addiction, and crime, these are all seem to be perennial issues in Sault Ste. Marie. And the health of the environment and climate change is an issue in Sault Ste. Marie like the rest of the country. And so the leaders of these parties who want to be prime minister or get enough seats in the House of Commons to really make a difference are facing the challenge of balancing between economic resiliency and economic growth, creating the kind of tax base through economic growth that will enable an investment in health, while at the same time coming up with a strategy for fighting climate change and trying to make save the planet from environmental crisis. And that's a pretty tall task. The last provincial election in Sault Ste. Marie was determined by the slimmest of margins, roughly 100 votes. And the same thing can happen in particular ridings across Canada. So really, voting matters. Every vote matters. And although we don't get to vote for our Prime Minister directly, our votes and how many seats each of these parties collects in the House of Commons does determine our next Prime Minister and leader of the country. And if it's a case of a minority government, it matters how many seats the other parties have to form kind of coalitions when it comes time to vote. So every vote matters. I'd encourage all people who are eligible to vote to get out there and do it, and to get to know the party's platforms, to get to know the local candidates and the federal candidates, and also to look at the polls and to vote with open eyes about what's really at stake I don't think voting according to principle is a bad thing, but I don't think voting according to strategic voting with eyes wide open is a bad thing either. So get out there and vote on election day.
Whoever gets elected, we need to address this opiate epidemic.
Yeah, they're not going to. The problem with that is we're in a crisis now. We have too many people, not enough houses. So who's got the most money is going to win. So they're not going to be able to do that. And if they're going to build a bunch of houses, it's going to take years to do it. You can't do it in 5 minutes.
Biggest issue in the election for me right now is our threat to Canada by our somewhat crazy neighbors to the south. I'm very concerned about what they are trying to do, both economically and politically, to our country. And I see that as the biggest threat that has to be addressed by the government that comes into place.
Well, working for the people. I mean, if you're going to work for the people, first of all, you have to be there to take the questions. If you're not here to take the questions, how is that going to happen? I haven't seen him knocking on my door to ask my advice or what my wants are.
He should be visionary, a good leader. He should be good for the country, and he always looking for a success for a country. So that's what the qualities that I like in my prime minister. Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a lot of importance that where it seems like there's a shift towards not paying attention to the environment and not focusing on our change into sustainable energy. I think we need to be mindful that if there are those shifts going to happen, what does it mean for us? And how do we continue to stay on a trajectory of a more sustainable future?
Welcome back to the local campaign, where we are discussing the election results. The election results, as the numbers come in, are going to be at the bottom of your screen. Our next guest this evening is the president of the Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce, Charlotte Robinson. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Charlotte, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Norm.
Did you want to? You said you wanted to ask a question. Did you want to do the first one?
Yeah,
okay. First question goes to me. So much of the bandwidth this election has been taken up by Donald Trump's administration's trade war. Can you give us a sense of how many businesses within the Chamber's memberships rely on U.S. imports or exports, or are affected by the trade uncertainty? And what are the sentiments of your membership?
Well, certainly, I would say broadly, every business is impacted by this trade uncertainty. Uncertainty isn't good for business. We're hearing from folks that, people are maybe pausing on making purchases, or projects are being put on hold or canceled just because of this uncertain environment. So everybody is feeling that. Specifically, though, we've got a number of businesses locally that are maybe impacted by the direct tariffs on things like steel or aluminum. And so they're feeling that specifically. And then there's also folks that are impacted more indirectly, because maybe something that they're purchasing to put in their product or to sell directly is a direct tariff, either by the U.S. or the retaliatory tariff. So it sort of depends on different types of business and what you're buying and what you're selling, if you're directly impacted or indirectly impacted, but everybody's feeling the impact in some way.
It's a bouncing ball, Charlotte, literally and figuratively. Really, and in my lifetime watching politics and international relations and foreign affairs and all of that, I've never seen anything like this. Uncertainty is a good word. How disruptive is this, like truly, to the local small business person who has a supply chain somehow, or a product selling somehow involving the United States, which I'm sure most of them do? How bad is it?
Well, again, it depends on the business. So let's look at our local craft brewers, right? So they're still trying to figure out what happens to them, because they need aluminum cans. From what I understand, based on my conversations with them, the aluminum that is used to make the cans is actually Canadian aluminum, but we don't have a can producer in Canada. So that Canadian aluminum gets shipped to the U.S., which is then tariffed by the U.S. 25%. And then before that, once that can is produced, it comes back to Canada, and there's potential of an additional retaliatory tariff on that can. So you could be talking layers of tariffs. And then, what do you need maybe in some of your production, machinery, that sort of thing? Some of those things you can only get from the States. Some of those things, require parts that are under the tariff. So it's just so complicated, and it's really dependent on business by business as to how they're being impacted. But then now we have the added complication of some of the international tariffs. So a lot of things that come to local retailers maybe are made in China, but if they're shipped directly to a Canadian distributor, then they wouldn't be subject to the U.S.'s tariffs on China. But if they go through a U.S. distributor, then they would be subject to the U.S.'s tariffs on China. So it's really hard to kind of unravel what's happening. And pretty much everybody that I'm talking to is saying, I'm waiting for the next invoice. I'm waiting for when I get my order, because then I'll know what's impacted and what's not. And so again, people putting off, maybe I'm not going to order because I'm not sure exactly how much extra I'm going to pay. And so they're trying to manage those challenges. It's complicated.
So we're in a federal election campaign period. Tonight is the election. You've written an open letter to the federal candidates asking for programs to support businesses, your members, when they're hit with tariffs. They're already hit with tariffs. More are going to come. What's going to happen, with the 90-day reprieve or pause or whatever words he used? What would that mean exactly? How does the federal government help local small businesses?
So there's a couple of things we're asking for. First, we're asking for businesses for help right now. So we've already seen both the federal and the provincial government have rolled out things like deferring payments of your HST remittances or your health tax remittances as a way to help businesses keep the cash in their bank account during this uncertainty. So that's helpful. But what about things like grants and loans to help them with some of the extra costs that they might be feeling? Those are some of the things that some businesses are asking for. Or we've seen some programs starting to kind of come together around how do we help these businesses that maybe were really dependent on the U.S. to look to other markets? How can they export to other countries? That doesn't happen overnight. You need to do a whole bunch of market research. You probably need to find, distributors and partners and shipping. All that kind of stuff takes time and money. And so getting the federal government to be providing supports that help businesses to do that through the various, programs that are available through Export Development Canada, the Business Development Bank of Canada, those sorts of things. So it's really a little bit about helping us today, but it's also about helping in the long term so that they have a more diverse opportunity in the future as well.
Thank you for that. You've also highlighted the need to remove barriers to trade and labor mobility between provinces. Many people don't know or are aware of these barriers. For our listeners who might not know, what are some examples of these barriers, and how do they affect businesses or workers trying to operate across Canada, and what role do the provincial and federal governments play in these barriers?
Yeah, so I think just to start, I'm really thrilled to see this conversation has been happening for decades about these barriers, but there really hasn't been any incentive for the provinces and the feds to come together. So it's really great to see this focus on this issue. But you're asking about specifics. So things like health and safety regulations, what are the inspection requirements? Things like as simple as the size of a wheel on a truck if the truck is going across different provincial borders. Commercial vehicles may have to have different inspections as they go from province to province. Packaging and labeling regulations. So, you make a package that works for BC, but you need a different package if you're going to Quebec. Marketing boards that control things like dairy or poultry, different regulatory systems on different things in different provinces. And then, of course, everybody's favorite, beer and wine, right? Like, right now, you can't actually get BC wine in Ontario without going through a whole rigmarole as, someone who wants to bring that through. We need to break these barriers down. We need to be one country that provides opportunity for businesses everywhere to do business with other provinces and communities.
You know, it's a great point, and everyone, all parties, the provincial governments, the federal government are all agreeing to eliminate these trade barriers. One important aspect of that is labor mobility. Charlie, you cited several examples that are just nonsensical. Truck tires, BC wine, all of that. But this is going to be a really tough nut to crack. Labor mobility, for example, in the professions in healthcare. I remember back in the 1990s, I was a paramedic. We had 2 years college training to be a paramedic. We were the only province that had 2 years college. Every other province had 1 year college, some months of college. So a PEI or Alberta paramedic who wanted to work in Ontario basically had to go to school again. And healthcare is a provincial responsibility, but this is a productivity issue. And it's how we respond to tariffs. How does this get beat? Or can it get beat? Can it get beat? Does the federal government somehow impose standards that the provinces don't have to agree with?
Yeah, we've seen those conversations happening already, and I think that interprovincial labor mobility is one of the key priorities that all provinces have agreed on working on. And we've seen some provinces already saying that they're going to do sort of a reciprocal, you know, as long as Ontario accepts our folks, we'll accept their folks, and that kind of approach. Certainly, the province of Ontario just announced agreements with 2 Atlantic provinces to basically say, you know, one for one, we're going to align our regulations to allow labor mobility between our provinces. So, but you're right, it's not only interprovincial. Then you get into things like foreign credentials, where we're attracting individuals to come to Canada, but then they get here and the paperwork they brought really does no good. And so that's another layer of, you know, how do we address some of the challenges, not only between the provinces, but in bringing folks from other countries to make sure that they can actually help with our labor needs.
All right, I have another question for you. The Chamber has also called for modernizing the federal tax system to encourage business investment. Can you break down what this means, and how could a simpler, more supportive tax system make a difference for small businesses or startups in our community?
Yeah, this is another issue that certainly Chambers of Commerce have been talking about for many years, and it's kind of nice to see that finally these things are coming to the general discussion. There was even an article in the Globe and Mail just this past weekend talking about the need for tax reform. So the last time that our tax system was, you know, really looked at in a broad way was back in the 1960s, when there was a Royal Commission on the tax system. So think about how much has changed since the 1960s. And the tax rules have just sort of been layer upon layer of new things on top of old things. And it's now a really complex tax system. You've got tax credits, you've got multiple types of taxes, different rates depending on what kind of tax it is, you know, capital gains versus corporate tax versus tax on split income versus your personal taxes. It's really complicated. And that is a barrier, because basically, if it's too complicated, it means you have to spend more money or spend more time to try to make sure that you're complying with the tax rules. And so it becomes a barrier, almost becomes red tape, because you're spending time on something that is really not driving productivity or driving economic growth, just in order to comply with the rules. So we've been pushing for tax reform as a way to simplify the tax system, to make it easier, and there be less barriers. But also, let's make sure that where we're taxing, how can we ensure that the tax system is actually promoting businesses to invest, to grow their business, to be more productive, to be more efficient, rather than a drag where, oh, if I do this, then it might mean that my tax rate goes up, and so I'm not going to invest, because now it's just going to cost me more money than I'm actually going to earn, right? So those are all the things that we're talking about, and we're pushing the government to come up with a better system, to really take a broad look at taxes, and how can we ensure that they're helping to drive our economy rather than make our economy slow down and lag.
The Liberals and the Conservatives both have specific policies in their platforms on reducing taxes and reducing GST in certain ways, you know, new homes, that kind of thing. Similar but different. The NDP have said essentially they're going to keep the public service the same and not reduce taxes, but for some exemptions that would drive productivity, I think. I haven't, have you seen, though, specific commitments from parties about small businesses and how to make business easier to navigate from the party platforms?
At this point, the party platforms are a little bit high level. Again, there's some sort of high level commentary about, reducing taxes for small business and making it easier for small businesses by simplifying taxes, but we haven't got the details. So these are the kinds of things that we're continuing to bring up in conversations as I was meeting with candidates, and certainly I know the Canadian Chamber and the Ontario Chamber are having those conversations, more high level as well, because we need the specifics of what would be happening under the new government, and so we'll wait to see who's elected and continue those conversations to try to make sure that they understand what small business really needs from them.
You've mentioned that a number of these issues are longstanding issues. How much traction do you think that these issues are going to have once the new government is formed? And is this, I don't want to say tariffs are a good thing, but it's acting as a catalyst for these types of changes. How confident are you that these changes are going to happen and how much traction you're going to get?
It does feel like this is an exceptional time. Certainly our country is faced with much different challenges than we have seen in many decades. And so I think it has forced all party leaders to really look at how can we make Canada stronger? How can we support Canadian business growth? How can we attract business to invest here versus other jurisdictions? And so it's really opened that conversation a lot more, and I feel confident that that will continue. It's kind of lit the fuse for some significant change to happen, and it feels like not only are the federal parties aligned on that, but also all of the premiers across the country are aligned on the need for change. And so a lot of that friction that maybe was there in the last number of years is now smoothing out as everyone's looking for how do we make Canada the most successful country that we can be.
That's a great close.
Yeah.
Making Canada the most successful country we can be. Fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlotte. We really appreciate you joining in.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you, Charlotte.
Good to see you as well. Thanks for including me.
I need a prime minister that can understand what is going on both internally in Canada with the regional discrepancies and differences that we do have and should be acknowledged, and play on that to use their strengths to make a divided Canada a united Canada. I want someone who understands business and will listen to the people, not just as MPs and any of these political action parties. We need people who will listen to us regular people, and work on the issues that are facing us besides the national crisis, cost of living, homelessness, affordability, etc. So that's what I'm looking for, someone who can listen to everybody and unite us and work with everybody to make Canada a more stronger and better place to live.
So I would say that one thing, if I have to say to the Prime Minister, that it would be like an immigrant too. And I feel like, in the last few years, there has been, like a certain increase in the number of immigrants from different countries, which is good in such way. But I feel like, as a student, it's not unfair, because I think they are therefore focusing more on the quantity of students than quality, and then it's very unfair for the students, who are really here for genuine reasons, and then it's very unfair. So if they would concentrate on that, that would be great.
I think it would just make sure that our future pays attention to the connectedness across the entire country. I think that that's really important. No matter what happens internationally, who we are as Canadians and where we want to go is extremely important. So I think that in a broader sense, that should be the focus.
Well, I think, in terms of the election issues and the issues we want to see addressed, the most important one right now is probably because of the instability of the U.S. government and the tariffs on and off. We're not sure really how that's going to impact us. And with that being said, we're looking forward to seeing what kind of support the new federal and recent provincial government will be able to provide for the business community and the community in general. That's an important issue for many. We also need to look at the job situation here. Lots of jobs, no employees, and when an employer is trying to bring somebody into town, they have no place to live. And with that, we're encouraged to hear that there will be new housing opening up for people coming in, which will certainly help boost the morale in the business community. But with the uncertainties, one of the things obviously we want to do is encourage local shopping, support the local business community as best you can, buy Canadian, and we're all in this tough time together. When we look at some of the other issues that we hear from the business community, and we've addressed or brought that to, say, the city and government attention, is, of course, the crime situation downtown and, within the city. And we know that everybody's putting in a lot of effort to address the issues, but it's still going to take a lot of work and probably a lot more support from the provincial and federal governments moving forward. We have some programs on the job side that we look forward to getting more government support. For example, the Canada's Summer Jobs Program is a great program for university students or high school students, but it's just limited to an eight-week program. With that, that makes it a little difficult for a university student to come in who's available for 16 weeks. It's tough to just hire them for 8 weeks because they want something a little more steady. So we've been discussing that with the federal government while they were still in session to try and get that lengthened, or the duration increased, so that we can get the people we need. And I guess most of all, we don't want to be forgotten up here in the Northwest. Federally, Eric Malillo has been good for us. He's been receptive, but we're going to work with whoever gets elected and in power. Well, I think the tariffs, dealing with that and getting some support, because that is a huge uncertainty globally. And yeah, it's going to affect us here. So, finding out what support's going to be available for that, and what can the business communities do in Kenora, in the region, to make it through that. They're eventually going to end one way or another, but it's still a challenging time. We had a challenging time during COVID, and many companies did okay, or recovered well, but some unfortunately didn't. But also the other priorities would be, ensuring housing for new employees coming in, or even new companies coming in. If you want to relocate to Kenora, it's a great place to relocate, but the housing has to be there for them. Nobody said business was going to be easy. And, the world is quite a bit more complicated now than it was even a few years ago or pre-COVID. It's just, we have to adapt.
The big thing with the tariffs, and we're dealing with the Ontario Chamber and the Canadian Chamber, which is federal, is nobody's nailed down how it's going to impact our businesses on the receiving end and the transportation to wherever they're going. They're starting with some initiatives now, like an insurance on your products being shipped. But one of the things we talk with our businesses through OCC is they're allowing 6 months of a relief, but it's not really, you got to pay it at the end of October. So in that time, you're not paying some of the government mandated stuff, and they said, oh, just pay it later. Well, a lot of these businesses can't afford to do that, and you're stuck with a bill at the end of it. So really knowing how it's going to affect us, nobody has those answers. And Ron is absolutely correct, is all the tariff is happening in Kenora. We don't hear how it's impacting our business, our bigger businesses, even the smaller ones for importing goods out of the United States. So there's no real definite answers yet. They're trying. We're on weekly calls every Wednesday with the OCC, and they're trying to clarify as much, but it's as muddied water as everything changes weekly. And a lot of businesses they're going to suffer because of not knowing. I mean, it's business. Hopefully the Shop Canadian, Shop Local is really going to instill on people is you got to support your people. And opening up the provincial boundaries to ship the products across Canada and import from other provinces into Ontario. So those are main things we've got to start trading within our own country and take down the barriers. But again, there seems to be a lot of roadblocks with that of passing those. Ontario is a good one. They have to pass it in the House to make it into fruition for the East Coast to be able to trade with Ontario. So they're pushing, and as everything, it takes time. Is it time we have? I'm not sure. As the days and weeks and months go on, it's going to be tough on some businesses.
I think with the tariff crisis coming up, like Andy says about the interprovincial trade barriers, we didn't, I don't think anybody thought that those are a real challenge. They could live with it and adapt to it, but now with what's going on globally, maybe those barriers should come down. Well, first off, give us some help with the tariffs. We'll work, as best we can on that. Make sure that we have effective job programs, for example, temporary summer student jobs. Make sure that they're not unnecessarily cut or reduced, because that's an important time for university students and high school students to gain some experience, make some money, and help contribute to their education. So we often hear that some programs may be cut and maybe some won't, but let's just be careful about how that happens. Especially in areas like here, there's lots of jobs available, but we need to encourage people to stay here. So, and of course the housing, please provide the support that we can sustain it here. Kenora needs the tourists as well. I mean, we do have a lot of understanding and sympathy from many of the rational U.S. visitors, and we welcome them, and it's good for our business and our community.
I think it's really important. I mean, as in the past, we work with our federal representative here. I mean, it's tough when their leader's not in power, very limited of what they can do. And I mean, Eric takes all of are issues, but they're not seen in the same light as if the major party is in power and they have a representative in the community. He has limited say today, which really impacts our community, like Ron was saying. For Canada Summer Jobs, Ron has been very good at writing letters, but they really fell on deaf ears. And it's not just Kenora, Dryden, Fort Francis, Red Lake, Sulikout, all of the Northwest. We're all in the same boat of wanting the university kids to come back and work and maybe create a life here in Kenora. And as it stands, it's very difficult here for them to create a future and a career. And we've got to be the ones to push it, that there is a career at the end of the tunnel for them to have a good lifestyle. And that's the whole game with working with the federal government. Who's ever in power, we want to get their ear. And I think us belonging to Canadian Chamber also helps as we can get the word across. We're pushing out the Canada Summer Jobs. I've pushed it up to the OCC. Every community chamber in Ontario is having the same problem. So that goes to show you it's not a Kenora issue. They're having this all through Ontario. So taking it up, they're going to take it over to the ministry to bring back over to the federal government. And it is working. Today, we're 4 times what we were in 2019 as the amount of students and the amount of dollars that were secured to do it. So Ontario's leading across Canada in Canada Summer Jobs. So that goes to show you the money is being well spent. And it is a lot of money, but you're now giving an opportunity for the young people to see what they want to do. And, and let's not push them off to go live in Winnipeg or Toronto. Have an opportunity to live and a lifestyle here. So we're making them listen. and if you're at the table, you get to make the decisions. So.
But I think with the upcoming election, the most important thing to do is to get out and vote. Yeah. There's a lot of information and disinformation coming out on social media. Do your own research, do your own due diligence, and vote based on your opinion, not on somebody else's.
Thank you so much and welcome back. We are here for the local campaign on Rogers TV. You'll see the numbers across the bottom of the screen as the results come in. Our next guest is Holly Gavin. She is the Executive Director of Elevate here in Thunder Bay. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, Holly. Good to see you.
It's good to see you, Norm.
Okay, so I have some questions for you. Elevate NWO has highlighted that housing costs $16,000 per person annually versus the more expensive outreach services. What federal policies could prioritize permanent housing over temporary solutions?
There's several initiatives that I think that could be really, really helpful as we're addressing the housing crisis. There are things like scaling up the Reaching Homes program. It's a little known program here locally, but one that's been really, really effective in creating both short-term and longer-term projects that help to really move people through the homeless system and into homes of their own. And so a focus on permanent housings and wraparound supports, not just temporary placements, is something that needs to be considered. The province has been really big on giving us temporary solutions, transitional housings, and my question has always been, transition into what? Like, at some point, people need to be housed. They need to know that next month, next week, next year, I'm going to be in this location, right? And so I think that designing programs or supporting those programs that design sort of that graduated response from transition into permanent housing are things that should be really supported. Enshrining housing first as a national standard. This shouldn't just be a program; it should be a national standard. Now, I know there are critics of the housing first programs. They say they haven't worked everywhere, but my response to that is that where housing first models have failed, it's usually due to underfunding, poor implementation, or a lack of wraparound services. So these models, when they're fully supported and executed, can really be value for dollar. It can really, really help support people to stop that revolving door of homelessness. And the model does need to be updated to include couples and pets being allowed within the Housing First programs. Right now, it just really only provides support to single people, and so that's a failing of that project. But I would love to see that become a national standard. And I also think that mandating multi-year funding agreements so that organizations can also build on their momentum, build better infrastructure, work with their key stakeholders to actually develop plans that are sustainable, that are meeting the needs. By the time a program hits its stride, you're really looking at about the 12-month mark, and then you have to start the winding down progress, right? And so that's a terrible way to do business. And so those would be things that I would look for, and things that I would be interested in seeing from the leadership.
Holly, in this federal election campaign, the cost of housing and homelessness, two distinct but absolutely connected issues, have become paramount, perhaps more paramount than any other federal campaign I remember. They really are big deals. But how responsible is Canada or the federal government for these matters? Clearly, the federal government is intervening in the cost of housing and building more homes. But if we could focus on homelessness and underhoused populations for just a moment, what's the role of Canada, the federal government, vis-a-vis Ontario, the provinces, and municipalities? And what power does Canada actually have?
So, I mean, I'm going to say this, and this is going to be super unpopular, and I'm sure I'll get letters, but the fact is that this is an Indigenous issue. The point-in-time count that we did this year suggests that there's 78% of the people that were homeless at that point in time were Indigenous. Our own numbers from working on the street for the last, now into our 6th year, says that those numbers are usually between 85 and 95%. One year it was 99%. That meant one person was not Indigenous. So this is absolutely an Indigenous issue. And so the federal government has a responsibility to Indigenous people, a constitutional responsibility. And they're failing to address the housing of Indigenous people really dismisses the reality of urban Indigenous people who are falling through the cracks, and that the province often lacks the political will or the cultural competency to deliver effective Indigenous housing. We need our federal leadership and Indigenous-led solutions, period. So the federal government is essentially responsible and constitutionally bound to facilitating and assisting Indigenous people, and it's falling down. It's falling down on that promise. It's falling down on that obligation, and it needs to step up to the plate here. The province absolutely is responsible for housing for its people, but as Canadians, as federal leadership, they also are doubly bound to this, and they need to do more to support Indigenous people finding housing and securing housing and keeping that housing.
Holly, I don't dispute the facts that you cite about federal responsibility and provincial responsibility, but can the federal government, when it comes to actually helping homeless population, the vast majority of which are Indigenous, it's just a fact, do they have any direct levers that they can pull? Certainly they can incentivize the province and municipalities, but what authority does the federal government have to combat this problem?
The So, I mean, what authority do they have? I think that it's not even about authority. I think it's about leadership. I think it's about the impetus. They are constitutionally responsible for this. We know the information is out there. There have been calls made over and over and over again from Indigenous leadership. I think always lean back on the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. You know, this is calling into account particularly actions 18 through 24 really speak to housing as a social determinant of health and well-being, right? And so I think that they have the obligation, as far as, you know, what gives them the right to do that. I think that it's the will of the people, and it should be the will of the people that they deliver on this. They are also signatories of the Human Rights Code of Canada, right? And so where are they on that? Why aren't we seeing more investment from our federal partners in addressing the housing issues that are here in our community?
Now, Holly, you've been well known to advocate for auditing of vacant social housing units. What role should the next federal government play in ensuring that the housing stock is used effectively?
That gets tricky, right? Because a lot of the housing is provincially funded, but there are some federal housing stock available. I think that they should be playing a role. I think that there's a thing we do in social work when we're trying to get a certain behavior to stop and another behavior to start, right? And it's incentivizing, right? We incentivize the behavior we want rather than punishing the behavior we don't want. So I feel like the federal government could be really instrumental in changing the vacancy rates and making sure that we're maximizing those taxpayer-funded units through incentivizing faster turnover of those vacant units. So targeted repairs and retrofits, funding, bonus funding for maintaining low vacancy rates, grants for partnerships with agencies that house high needs populations. All of these things could work towards incentivizing the behavior we want, which is let's make sure that every nook and cranny is filled, and rather than us spending money on complicated Band-Aid solutions like going out into the homeless encampments and providing tents, and then also funding the maintenance of these vacant units, right? Like we're paying twice, and now here locally we're adding a new open air shelter to the mix. So it's kind of a lot that's going into it, but nothing is coming out of it. So it's become a bit of a black hole. So we need to see some incentivized programs. We need to call for an audit. You can't begin to assess how to address a need without first knowing what your resources are. So we need to know what the resources are. And there is no national data system, provincial data system that tells us what the vacancies are. So we have this point in time count that tells me how many people are homeless, but it doesn't tell me how many units I can expect to see turned over this year to help me combat that. So yeah, I think the federal government has a role to play in it, but I also think that that does not negate the province from also doing its part.
Now we've seen a complete absence of any Indigenous issues in this year's election. It's absent in party platforms. Can you give us an idea of what tools that the listeners can use to help evaluate a party's platform to get any glimpse as to how to fix this issue?
Yeah, so I mean, speaking to like Thunder Bay residents, you know, just knowing what we've learned over the years doing this work, Things that people should know is that they should absolutely be looking for candidates that are prioritizing Indigenous people, particularly in cities like Thunder Bay, where the majority of unhoused individuals are Indigenous. We should absolutely be expecting this from our leaders. We should be looking for leaders that want to move beyond transitional housing units and into those more permanent solutions, or are interested in supporting organizations who can come up with those solutions. I think that we should be looking at leaders who are interested in doubling down on housing first and modernizing it, bringing it into, this day and age, so that it does include couples who are so often left behind in shelter systems, in housing systems, in all the systems, and people with pets. I mean, I, not for love nor money could you separate me from my puppy. So for too many people, those relationships and companions are just not negotiable. So you telling them that they can't bring their partner with them is telling them they may as well stay homeless, right? And I think we need to see a plan from these candidates that also supports landlords, because this is a risky business to get into right now. Landlords are they're a tough bunch, and they're really up against it. And most of the landlords in this city are not corporate landlords. They're little landlords. They're moms and pops who put their retirement savings into a property and things didn't go well. And now they're left holding the bag. So I think things that would be helpful is repair funding, incentive programs for working with housing programs, eviction prevention tools. All of these things would go to create more stable housing stock, and keep more people housed for longer, and hopefully also help landlords feel a little bit better being in that particular line of work.
Thank you so much. I have one last question for you, Holly. If you could give your clients a voice, what would you say to our candidates on the behalf of the people you serve?
So many things, and I wish that they were all here with me today right now to say it themselves. But I'd say that over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen this huge growth in the homeless population, and so our folks are not invisible anymore. They're veterans, they're grandmas, they're youth aging out of foster care, they're survivors of residential school, they're people living with trauma and untreated trauma. They deserve homes, not handcuffs, not tents, and not judgment about how they survive. If you want to lead this country, you need to look them in the eyes, you need to listen to their truths, and you need to build a system that includes them. In short, I would say, are you building Canada where everyone matters, or just the ones with fixed addresses?
Excellent note to end off on. Do you have any other comments?
Thanks so much, Holly.
Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Thank you both. Appreciate you.
I think the biggest issue would be just homelessness and the lines at the food bank. And I would say just look who's been in for the last 9 years. And they really take a lot of taxes off your paycheck, but they're not putting it where they say they're going to put it. So I would be voting for somebody completely new, because even though they've changed the face of the leader, it's all the same policies and all the other people are still the same. They aren't fighting for the people and what they really need. So it sounds good, looks good. We're gonna do stuff, but they never do what they're gonna say they're gonna do. It's time for something completely new.
I think for a local MP is just really being in tune with what's happening in their riding and how they can deliver that message when they go to Parliament, and the committees that they might work on or whatever, whether in opposition or in governance, making sure that the constituents that they represent are actually being represented, and that when anything that might be happening nationally, they're also able to work on it in the context of their own region.
One of the biggest issues that I feel is that over the years we've had I'm talking federal level here, of course, we've had a government where I feel it's really detached from a lot of, I put myself in middle class, I own a concert hall here, the John Saunders Center here, and I see we've had 9,000 people through for the concerts. So you get a chance to talk to people, and they're feeling the same. There's just that anxiety of like, I can't make decisions because I don't know if I should be saving my money. I don't know what the government's going to be doing, and you got a lot of young families that are just struggling right now, and I have a son. He'd be 28 years old, and he's even having a hard time figuring out his future. And we need a government that's really going to get down to the people level, that really understands what it's like to live in a community, not up at the parliament. I used to live in Ottawa, and I understand that, but we need a government that's down here at ground level, understanding, our needs. We've got a great mayor here. She understands that, but at the federal level, I just wish they would just get more involved in our lives. And this is what I hear. It's just like they're in a whole different financial camp even. The rest of us are just trying to figure out, how we're going to save to the future. What can we really buy to the future? So I'm hoping this next change, whoever it is really involved with us more.
Welcome back to the local campaign. Election results are going to be across the bottom as results come in. Norm, we've had several guests on. We've had segments. One thing that's kind of standing out to me is something that Charlotte Robinson was speaking about, and that's breaking down the trade barriers between the provinces. And, okay, I know I'm going to get this wrong, but it made me think of Italy before it became Italy, and when Napoleon was gobbling up land and going on his rampage, and Italy at the time, well, it wasn't Italy, there were principalities or principates,
city-states.
Yeah, they said, you know what, we need to band together and be stronger. Do you see the parallel between what Canadian provinces are going through now with Donald Trump as the Napoleon-type character?
I think if you stretched it, perhaps, but at that time, Italy was not a nation. There were commonalities, and they felt Italian.
Right.
But Canada is a sovereign nation and has been for some time. And what Canada is a federation, of course, with two levels of government, the federal government and the provinces, and associated with the territories as well. So two levels of government that have a partnership that agreed in 1867 this was a division of responsibilities. So, what Donald Trump has done, amongst many things, is provided an impetus for, let's call it a unification of policies and governance and regulations that before this had not existed in Canada. The truck example is a terrific example, right? 10 different regulations for heavy trucks traveling across Canada. What's that all about? And clearly that's a strain on productivity.
It's the bureaucracy of it all.
Bureaucracy is not a bad word. But, reducing these trade barriers and reducing regulatory barriers and labor mobility in the nation, in Canada, is going to be really tough when the provinces have their own responsibilities, like healthcare and education, responsibility of the province.
Do you think that's easier to do than to fight Donald Trump on his tariffs?
I think it's a necessary condition to fight Donald Trump on the tariffs. If we don't do it, we're doomed. And like we commented earlier, everybody who's in this game agrees that it needs to happen. I am somewhat, cynical's the wrong word, but worried about our ability to get it done. And the regulation thing, I think, is easier than the labor mobility. Professionals, tradespeople who have their own standards for whatever reason per province, which standards are going to stay and which ones are going to go.
Well, it brings up a point that what role does the federal government play in regulating the province's intertrade barriers? It
depends. It depends on the industry, it depends on the profession, it depends on the business. Healthcare and education are the clear responsibility of the provinces, so is housing. The federal government simply cannot come in and direct provinces to do something with this. Like healthcare, they can incentivize, which they've done with the Canada Health Act, which provides for some uniformity in healthcare across Canada. But that's because the federal government provides funding, transfer payments to the provinces, and the provinces have agreed in order to accept these transfer payments, which they rely on, they agree to these standards under the Canada Health Act. So it's incentivization, right? But Canada just can't come in and tell Ontario to do something with healthcare. Build a hospital here, hire more doctors, more long-term care beds. Canada has no authority to do that. When it comes to transportation and the trucking industry, that's another provincial responsibility. So Canada can simply incentivize, or what I hope is happening and what appears to be happening is the provinces are agreeing to this. Provinces are saying, yeah, this is crazy. We need one trucking standard across the country. I don't know who would argue against that.
Right.
I certainly am not.
Well, the Truckers Association probably.
Well,
I don't know. Maybe they would be for it.
I don't know who they are, but they probably have a standard that they want. This is the standard we think it should be, whatever it is.
This also came up during the English debate, the leaders' English debate. We heard the Bloc leader, Blanchette, say over and over again, oh, you're dipping your toes into provincial. Yeah. So even the federal leaders, not getting it wrong, but the waters appear to be a little muddied. Are there clear lines that this is provincial, this is federal, or is there really a role for the federal government to play here?
I think that few people actually understand the division of powers between governments in Canada. And this gives some license or some room to federal party leaders to comment on things that are clearly provincial legislation. Housing, cite one example, the housing is a provincial responsibility, and sometimes, let's talk about Ontario, downloaded in some way to municipalities. But it is a provincial responsibility. All three major federal parties, let's not include the Bloc for this case, because we're not voting for the Bloc in Northwestern Ontario. But the three major parties, and add the Green Party, the PPC, and whatever other parties are out there. But the three major parties have policies, platforms on housing. And often they sort of subtly or tangentially acknowledge that they'll do this by incentivization. And this meaning municipalities shall do this, municipalities shall or will do that, or will incentivize municipalities when it comes to housing. The Conservatives say they're going to get the gatekeepers, that's their word, the gatekeepers out of the way when it comes to housing. And what they mean are municipal bureaucrats and municipal elected officials, you and me, or at least I'm retired, what I used to be, right, out of the way. How?
I don't know, but I could put my feet up on that issue.
But that's a rhetorical question. You don't have the answer to that, because I don't know what the answer is other than incentivization. Canada cannot come to the city of Thunder Bay or the city of Kenora or the city of Sault Ste. Marie and say, this is what you're going to do about housing. You're going to reduce development charges, you're going to have fewer inspections, and you're going to get rid of red tape by 50%.
It has happened where MPs have dipped their toes in that, though.
I'm not aware of such an occurrence.
Yeah, when the city of Thunder Bay passed a resolution saying that the temporary village will go on May Street. It was a location on May Street. We actually had an MP dip into that, wade into the waters, into the weeds of municipal politics. Was that an anomaly, do you think, or is that something that...
So I am aware of that, and that was MP Marcus Pulowski, right? Who opined publicly that he was opposed to the City of Thunder Bay's move for the shelter village. Regardless of what one's view is on this, it doesn't matter for the point of discussion, right? Village good idea, village bad idea. I'm not weighing in on that here, but I think the MP Pulowski actually did have some license to do that.
Okay.
Whether you agree with what the policy is.
Well, obviously I disagree because I'm on the other side,
okay. Yeah. But the village relies upon funding from Canada, right? Does that not give Canada a voice? That's rhetorical.
Well, the funding we got is, I think, is going to come from a provincial stream.
Right, so far.
So far.
So far.
But he hasn't, the federal government has not come with cash on the table for the municipality
But
to
if
use.
the discussion is that we rely on funding for Canada, does that not give the elected representative from Canada a voice?
Could that not be true then of the federal government wading into the provincial waters?
Well, okay, so that's a different argument, right? Because you're seeking funding from Canada.
Okay.
Therefore, Canada ought to have a say and be able to comment on it. Secondly, another argument why he would have license to do what he did, again, regardless of whether you agree with it, is that he's representing his constituents. That's his riding. And why not have an opinion on that? The people that I vote for, I want to know what their opinion is.
That's an interesting point. One thing, that we're debating whether or not the federal government is wading into provincial or municipal matters. One thing that has interested me over this election is the lack of Indigenous platforms, platform pieces in any of the, or issues in the platforms. It's alarming to me. Right. I find when I talk to the Indigenous leadership and people that I know, asking them for comment on it, they said, well, why would I comment on this? There's nothing in it for me. I see it as being problematic, especially that Indigenous affairs falls solely in the camp of the federal government, with some provisions of provincial governments are treaty holders as well. But that's the federal jam. Why is it missing? Do we have any idea?
So we heard from Holly earlier, where she said she gave what to me was eminently logical rationale why Canada, the federal government, should be involved in housing because of the impact on Indigenous peoples, right? The disproportionate.
That was a very good argument that she made for that.
The disproportionate impact on Indigenous people. Yeah. But I think two comments here. First of all, the NDP, they do have a specific piece in their platform on Indigenous issues and how they relate to Canada and that. But also, I think arguably, many of the policy platforms have a direct line impact to Indigenous concerns. Healthcare, education, provincial responsibilities with federal involvement, security, resource extraction, the environment, the North, and the defense issues from the North, building a base on Baffin Island, CFB Iqaluit, one of the conservative policies. The Liberals and Conservatives have both committed to investing more in the North to protect sovereignty and involving Indigenous and First Nations in those decisions and how that happens. But I think there is a broad spectrum across that's not specifically Indigenous, but is applicable at the same time. But the NDP, from what I can tell, looking at the platforms on the websites, are the only ones that have specifically iterated an Indigenous platform.
I don't think NDP are going to form government, though. I mean, I'm obvious. Are you going to counter this point too?
Elections
I'm
matter.
Waiting for it.
Elections matter.
They do. They do. Let's shift gears a little bit. We've got a few more minutes on the clock. Actually, was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we get into
no, I'm good.
Talking about the different races?
Let's go.
Okay. Should we take a break?
Sure.
Let's take a break.
Let's take a break.
I mean, there's lots going on right now in the world today, and I think it's very important that in this country we continue to build relationships and try to grow understanding both at a local and regional level, and of course nationally and hopefully internationally. And so I just think that it's really important that in a time where it seems like relationships are falling apart, it's important for us as Canadians to try to get together and find solutions where it looks like there's only problems right now.
The biggest issue for me right now is the uncertainty with tariffs and the relationship we have with the United States. And I think having a strong Prime Minister that can, from an economic perspective, focus and deal with those issues so that we get back to some stability.
I think it's a combination of things. I think that there needs to be a more proactive communication between the provinces and the federal government. Responsibility can fluctuate a little bit in terms of how investments should be made. And I think overall, the overarching theme should be how do we, the people who are involved more directly need to have opportunities to speak on that behalf. And when it comes to federal investments or transfer payments, it's extremely important that they get it right in terms of how each level should be responsible.
I would say false information too. I don't think that they're going to keep their promises, like especially the Liberals. I think with cutting the carbon tax, they'll do that right now to get elected, and then after it, I think they're going to have more taxes onto it. So I would not be voting for Liberal.
Some leadership in terms of just having an idea of how they want to do things, making sure that people come on board, and just following through with the plan and some sort of consistency. But at the same time, being able to make adjustments when things shift. You know, we're in a situation where things are extremely fluid, and you need someone that's able to make a shift when necessary, when if something were to come up last second. My name is Anthony Leake, and I'm a resident of Kenora, and I am the promoter of Lake of the Woods Speedway, as well as an employee for Seven Generations Education Institute. Federally, it has historically has had some liberal in it. It's had conservative more recently. I don't think that there's much for historic trends that would say, you know, it's always been this way or always been that way over the last 25, 30 years. I think that the way people vote is a lot more different now than it was in the 80s and 90s. It's been conservative for the last while, which I think, other than a liberal for a little bit for a short time in 2015. But yeah, it's been an interesting dynamic here. It has shifted over the last 15 to 20 years. For me, I really kind of have a specific way in terms of how I vote, but my involvement in terms of federal stuff is just, I see what the platforms have to say, I see who's running, and I usually make a decision on election day. I think it really comes down to what change means. Whether it's a party change or a local MP change or a policy change or leadership change. And this election, what I've seen so far has been very much of leadership. It isn't necessarily party politics really going on. I mean, it is to an extent, but it seems that there's a hyper focus on leadership. And I think that's a direct result of the United States, Donald Trump. You know, people don't necessarily look at Donald Trump as being the leader and the president of the Republican Party. It's Donald Trump. And I think that that's kind of seeped into Canadian politics in this election where, you know, people are looking at Pierre, or they're looking at Mark, or they're looking at Singh, and they're saying, okay, you know, who's of the leadership, who's going to guide Canada into the future, knowing the dynamic that we're in the world right now. And so I think that while your hardliners that are for the parties will continue to vote wherever they need to vote, but when it comes to the electorate that's trying to decide one way or the other, they're not necessarily looking straight at policies. They're looking at who's the leader that's going to guide us through the next at least 4 or 5 years. Some of the biggest issues, I think economics is a big one in terms of managing world trade and our relationship in it. That has been the focus of it over the last several months, and I think that's going to continue. Affordability is a common election issue every time, whether it's provincial or federal. It's a day-to-day thing. People see that every day in terms of going to the grocery store or buying hardware or utilities, property taxes, so on and so forth. And people want to know where their money's going to and what their options are in the future in terms of savings, in terms of investments, where are markets going. So, you know, no matter where you are in terms of economic scale, businesses, individuals, families, what age groups, where it's a primary concern. I think that no matter what happens with different items, where people's money is usually a main thing. And there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And the question is, how does economics and free trade and the local business owner play into other things such as social supports and when it comes to things like daycare, when it comes to supporting families and trying to find a balance between all that, between the economics and the social side. It's not an easy job, that's for sure. But, everyone has varying priorities, but, I think that the economics of it is huge. Well, it's ongoing. I think it should always be of top concern. I think that relationship building is a huge priority. I think that while the federal government has the majority of impact with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in general, that there needs to be more relationship building between the federal and the provincial governments when it comes to treaty understanding. Treaties are more than actually treaties are not a business transaction. They are a relationship building and really a nation building block for the future of Canada. And so as a result of what has not happened the way it should be happening, there just seems to be this continual struggle of trying to build proper relationships between the provincial and the federal government in terms of responsibility and support, but of course the voice of First Nations themselves. And in our area, we have many, many First Nation communities, and they need to be a part of the relationship. It shouldn't be just a debate about who should be doing what where, but there needs to be some real voice and representation and some real equitable opportunity when it comes to the agreements that have been signed and the agreements that need to improve the lives of First Nations. Once again, it's the federal, provincial, and local governance structures. I think that there's a real gap in terms of communication, in terms of allocation of funding, and getting resources to people at the local level. And it seems like there's more fighting in between than there is necessarily trying to streamline resources. So depending on how the federal election goes, can determine how those funds become allocated. But what we've kind of noticed is that there's not been a significant shift in terms of how resources are allocated. There's still gaps in services. And, if we have people entered into one system, there's sometimes a gap in order for them to move into another system, and the wheels fall off, and people end up feeling kind of lost in this siloed resource. And so I think it's very important that if there's going to be new or different ways of doing things, that things become more streamlined in terms of knowing that if an individual, like for example, a criminal justice system, diversion programming is so important, but how do you connect the dots in diversion programming? How do you make sure that people can reconcile? How do you do restorative justice? How do you do things that help people reintegrate in their family and community groups? If we don't have those smaller steps in between the bigger steps, people get lost in these systems, and I think that really needs to change, and we need to look at that. I think there needs to be more voice that happens, not just in front of, everyone, it seems to be nice to go in front of the media and say this and that, but the real work happens behind the scenes. And when it comes to an MP, especially in this riding, it needs to be more than just a visit. It needs to be, how do you take the concerns, and when you have those committee meetings in Ottawa, being able to clearly communicate to other members what the needs are. And if you don't have an MP that can communicate in those settings and may be only good in front of the media, then there's no real progress, right? You know, I think the public tends to see, they do see the media side of things a lot more than what happens behind the scenes. But what happens behind the scenes is extremely important. And I think that, you know, for an MP, it's going to have a lot of value that even if they themselves can't make it, putting people in positions to continue the dialogue and make a change or an improvement.
Thank you so much and welcome back. We are on the local campaign, and tonight I'm Shelby Chung. I'm Shelby Chung every night. This is Norm Gale. It's probably a long night, going to be a long night. Election results are at the bottom of your screen. Let us talk about each of the ridings in Northern Ontario.
Okay.
So we've got Thunder Bay Rainy River, Thunder Bay Superior North, we have Sault Ste. Marie Algoma, and Kenora Kiiwetinoong. I think it's going to be, let's talk about Sault Ste. Marie first. Let's pull up the election results, or not the results, the
recent results?
Recent polling.
Oh.
So we have Terry Sheehan as the Liberal candidate right now, and he is the sitting member. So it looks like over time, as you know, in all the races where Liberal candidates, Liberals have candidates, that there's been a slight decline. We see it in Thunder Bay Superior North, Thunder Bay Rainy River. Kenora is different because Kenora has a Conservative candidate. We're seeing these trends. In your, I guess, professional opinion, do you think these trends are a linear fashion, or are there uptakes and it's a bit of an ebb and flow?
Well, I think there was a really big change with Justin Trudeau leaving and Donald Trump's commentary. And since then, I think it's been pretty steady with only very slight alterations, but generally reflected, as you say. But the big question for me was the huge change, the flip that happened within days, those two big occurrences at the same time.
It looks to me on paper that, you know, in 2015 we had this huge red wave that came through, and it almost is kind of mimicking that shape again with a big red wave coming through. They've lost support over time with Trudeau and a number of things that were just unpopular. But then they shifted gears, and now we're seeing that red wave come up. Well, what can we attribute the second wave to? Is it just Donald Trump? Is it?
It's not just Donald Trump, but it is Donald Trump. It's also Justin Trudeau is leaving. The presence and credibility of Mark
Carney. Yeah, I've worn off on you.
Yeah. And I think the shifting of the Liberal Party from the left more to the center and becoming a centrist party much more than it has been in the past 4 or 5 years at least.
Okay, let's talk about Thunder Bay Rainy River. So right now we have a Conservative,
Liberal.
Yeah, Liberal, Mark Plowski. Conservatives are nipping at the heels, it looks like. In the last vote, we saw Plowski was elected back in, so it was Don Rusnick actually back in 2015. Rusnick stepped aside. Plowski gets elected, looks like 2019. And he had 14,000 votes in 2019. And next in line was Conservative candidate Linda Ridholm at 12,000. Fast forward to 2021, we have Mark Plowski at 13,655 votes. So dips slightly, -1%. What does the polling show us right now for who's going to win that election?
The polling, I think, is showing strong Liberal.
Strong Liberal, okay.
But-
This is 338.
Right, at 338, but there's a strong Conservative element in that riding, Thunder Bay Atikokan, and the Conservative candidate is from La Valley Township, Brendan Hyatt.
Have you met Brendan before?
I've never met him.
I've met him once.
You did, okay.
I know his sister well. I babysat their kids.
Is that right?
In the East End, yeah. Great couple.
So I'm not sure how well known Brendan Hyatt is in Thunder Bay. And Thunder Bay, the voting is a huge chunk of the voting is in Thunder Bay on the south side. So how well he's known and what that impacts on the vote, I think will be interesting to see.
Now, because he comes from La Valley, do you think there's going to be an anti-Thunder Bay sentiment in that vote somewhere?
There probably is. There probably always will be, but it's insufficient. It's not enough to change the outcome of an election. In the Rainy River District, I'm not sure what the population there is, but the largest town is Fort Francis, and in several small rural communities. Compare that to 60,000 people in Thunder Bay South.
Right.
The numbers just aren't there, I think, for that to have a credible impact.
As a newcomer, I think that just watching his campaign evolve and the signs go up, I think he's got a pretty well-oiled machine behind him. It always, in videos, it looks like he's, like from a public relations perspective, it looks like there's a team.
Yeah.
I see the big truck go by with his name on it.
Conservatives are well organized.
Well, compare that now to Thunder Bay Superior North. The video of Bob Herman, who's the Conservative candidate, completely different story. It looks like it's Bob and his wife, and it doesn't look like there's much of a team behind him. This is just from comparing both Thunder Bay North and Rainy River and Superior North.
Conversely, Bob Herman, former city police chief for 11 years, is very well known in Thunder Bay. Has a profile, and a large segment of the electorate knows exactly who he is before they check out, before they vote. So it's a different dynamic when it comes to the Conservative candidates in Thunder Bay North and Thunder Bay South. Arguably, Bob Herman does not have to campaign the same way that Brendan Hyatt does in Thunder Bay Atikokan. And that might be, what you're seeing might be a reflection of that.
I wouldn't think that Bob Herman would say, oh, it's a walk in the park and wouldn't put my feet up.
No. I've never heard him say that, and I don't assert that. I don't think that's the case, but the dynamics are different. Bob Herman has name recognition. Brendan Hyatt does not, and I'm talking about the city of Thunder Bay,
right.
where the votes are.
That's interesting. I was just comparing the two of them, because I feel like Thunder Bay would vote somewhat, well, I guess it's not even always we always vote Liberal together or Conservative, because it didn't happen in the provincial election, obviously.
Right. But in Thunder Bay North, the vote for the NDP is stronger than in Thunder Bay South. And in Thunder Bay North, Thunder Bay Superior North, the NDP have a stronger presence than the Conservatives, but in Thunder Bay Rainy River, it's vice versa. The Conservatives have a stronger presence than the NDP.
Let's talk about that, the compare and contrast of the NDP campaigns for Superior North and Thunder Bay Rainy River. Thunder Bay Rainy River, no stranger to running for politics, Yuck Sum Wan. And then you have newcomer, Joy Wakefield, who's both, I've met Joy Wakefield, I've worked with Yuck Sum Wan, both of them understand their politics, where they're coming from. Joy Wakefield's a lawyer, has done a lot of human rights kind of stuff.
Teaches at this LU.
Very accomplished, very accomplished. Looking at both of their campaigns, it does look like there is far more support for NDP in Thunder Bay Superior North. Just looking at their campaign side by side. Even the TB News Watch had the war room for the NDP filled with people busying around and doing things. If I were on that team, I'd be like, that's the war room. And if I wasn't on the team, I'd be like, they've got a lot of people. So I think visually, it's quite striking to see that PR piece in my mind play out. just knowing what I know about, I've ran enough elections myself, how that plays into things. And then on the other side, I think Yaksamwan has her core supporters and will get things done. But visually, I think there's two different campaigns.
And additionally, your example of what was seen on the TV news coverage, in Joy Wakefield's coverage, there were prominent people in the background, people well known in the city of Thunder Bay. Yeah. And conversely, for Yuksam Wing, it was not the same. It was her.
Right.
And I think less of a play on her professional background as compared to Joy Wakefield's. But traditionally, the Conservatives are stronger in Thunder Bay, Rainy River, and the NDP are stronger in Thunder Bay, Superior North. And causation, correlation to the campaigns, I'm not sure.
Right. We've seen, okay, let's talk about the Liberal campaigns. Yeah. Patty Hajdu, very well polished, many clips of her doing work, communicating with people, the hugs, the smiles, very personable in her the PR piece of her campaign, versus Marcus Pulowski, who comes across as a little bit more of the academic, a lot of singular pictures with him by himself, very strong, stoic. What can we kind of derive from those two things, and is that reflective of the people they are?
There's two different styles between the two of them. Patty Hajdu's background is in social services. She was with the health unit and drug strategy with the City of Thunder Bay and the Shelter House as their executive director. But her entire career in politics, she's been a minister of the Crown. Prime Minister Trudeau appointed her as a Minister for Status of Women, I think, in 2015, right away. And I think three different ministries. So very high profile. And think about the pandemic, how profile Patty Hajdu was nationally during the pandemic as a Minister of Health. Marcus Pulowski, differently, has a very strong professional background. University of Toronto, Ivy League universities in the United States. He practiced medicine in Southeast Asia and Africa, working with impoverished people for a dozen years before coming back to Thunder Bay and working.
And he's a lawyer as well.
Yeah, and working in the Emerge Department in Thunder Bay, but not appointed to cabinet, not made a minister during his time. So, two different sets of experiences, and just two different approaches as well.
Right. But yeah, from a PR perspective, because I'm doing a master's in PR, so I'm looking at this election with completely different eyes. I'm looking for cues to show like where are the peacock feathers, to show like the grandstanding or the maybe the pulling back. Even listening to the leaders debate, it's just interesting. Pierre Poilievre comes across I feel like he's toned down the rhetoric, a little bit more personable, speaking, I think we talked about this earlier, speaking directly to youth. Mark Carney is the C-suite debater.
Poilievre did well in the debate.
Yeah.
When it comes to communications and persona and presentation, I think the best of the four of them. And Carney did come across C-suite.
C-suite.
Does that mean a little stiff?
When a C-suite debates, and I've heard you debate many times at the council table, even though you're not supposed to debate.
I just provide information and advice.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I think there's a certain status that CEOs have that they're maybe not questioned necessarily to the same degree. The questions that you would get as a C-suite member might be very factual and oriented, and it's not trying to catch you. Where politics is a little different. Type of debate.
From the C-suite, there's a sense of credibility that doesn't have to be earned by virtue of who you are and what you have done. And so people are less critical than they are of elected officials and people running for office. Elected officials are, it's easier to challenge, criticize, and be argumentative with elected officials.
Yeah, that is true.
You've lived that.
I've lived the life. It's really interesting because I had this thought, but I didn't know how to articulate it, and that's why you're on the show with me.
Oh.
I'm like, thoughts, blah, blah, blah. You're like, actually, a little polish here is fine. Can we talk about Kenora?
We can, sure.
Yeah, so we have Kenora Kiwet'inong. And who do we have in there? We have Eric Milello.
And he's the incumbent and running a very strong campaign.
I don't think there's been no crossover. We're looking at 338 right now.
338.
There was no, a slight undulation, but quite steady waters for his campaign. What do you think? What's the magic sauce there for Eric?
Well, I think it's a traditionally conservative riding, and Eric is a young fellow with a strong educational background and a policy background. He worked at the Northern Policy Institute in Thunder Bay for a few years.
He's quite impressive. And it's quite rare that you see, I think was he the youngest conservative member ever elected?
I don't know the answer to that.
Oh.
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm going to look it up later.
Okay.
But
Well, that's
I'm
what these
pretty
things
sure.
are for, right?
Yeah. The internet machine.
Yeah,
Do
yeah.
the thing on the internet machine. I'm pretty sure. Oh, and we have Charles Fox as
Yes.
well, who's running Liberal. Interesting about Charles Fox, he used to be the Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Nation.
Right.
So he has a lot of credibility with the Indigenous population. I'm interested to see, I would like to see a debate actually between those. I don't think that we will.
The Conservatives don't debate.
Right.
Right.
Right. I would still like to see it though. I want to see what Tiana Cameron, NDP. Do we know anything about her?
She is a.
Is it Tanya or Tiana? Sorry, I can't see that.
Tanya.
Tanya. Okay.
Tanya.
Tanya.
Yeah. I don't know much about her at all.
Okay. Did I have something for her? I was looking up.
This is her third campaign, though.
Okay.
And she has not.
She's not broken up, eh?
Not a strong showing in previous. Well, third both times.
Okay. I wonder what it would take to. Well, I think Charles Fox would be the one to watch in this election to see.
Credible, well-known candidate.
Yeah.
Not that Tanya's not credible. I just don't know.
Right. Just based off the numbers alone, I think Eric is going to be very difficult to take down. Extremely popular according to the polls, and Poly Analytics as well, that I'm a big fan of.
Tell us about that.
Tell you. You want me to tell you about it. You're so tired of me talking about AI. So I'm an avid watcher of the agenda. Steve Paikin, hero of mine, JMM, hero. They frequently bring on a guest. Her name is Erin Kelly. She is the CEO of Advanced Symbolics in Ottawa, and they have a program called Poly. And Poly is a blend of, from my understanding, traditional polling, like 338, as well as a listening device using AI to measure sentiment online through Facebook, X, online social media channels. So as people are posting, it's measuring sentiment, whether or not people are going to be, which way they're going to be voting. And then it does it in real time as well. So even from this morning when I looked at Poly AI to now, the votes have changed. It was projected a Liberal win, the majority line, 208 seats, and I think now Poly's saying, what's Poly saying? Yeah, high end of 208 seats, now it's saying, it's 206, but the gap is narrowed. So this morning was 143 to 208, and now it's 164 to 206, with 182 being the average.
Projecting a Liberal majority.
Projecting a Liberal majority. So that whole piece kind of moved over, truncated, and it shrunk up the Conservative as well, the Conservative polls. I find it so fascinating. She's one of my favorite guests. I actually wrote her and told her, fangirled her a little bit, so maybe she's watching. Hire me.
Very good.
I'm not looking for a job, but I just think it's absolutely fascinating. And I think it gives a bit of a different slice than 338. 338 lies. It does.
How do they lie?
They told me when I ran provincially for the
Okay.
Liberal Party that
Yeah.
I was going to be number one. And Norm, I came in third.
You're not lying.
They had my hopes up,
Yeah,
man.
yeah, it's not a lie.
Okay, not accurate.
Excuse me.
All right, is there anything else that you would like to chat
Well,
about?
we've covered the four ridings.
Yep.
Maybe it's time now to see what actually happens in real life.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Drinks at the pub?
Sure.
Let's do this. Thanks, Norm. He
That
didn't
was
want to
fun.
do this. He
No,
did
I
not
didn't want to do it, but it was fun.
It was fun.
I'm glad you made me.
Awesome. Always a pleasure, Norm. Always a pleasure.